The kingdom of Jerusalem is dying beneath the merciless desert sun. An army of 30,000 Muslim warriors is marching toward the heart of the Holy Land. At its head rides the most feared man in the East, Saladin. His blades shine like a sea of steel. His banners swallow the horizon. His victory seems so certain that, in his mind, the spoils have already been divided. Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, is about to fall. And worse than that, no one can stop him. No one, except a king who is barely 16 years old. A boy whose body is slowly being destroyed by leprosy. A young man who should be lying on his deathbed, not sitting on a war horse. His name is Baldwin IV. And against all logic, against every medical expectation, against the laws of nature themselves, he is about to write one of the most glorious pages in the history of European knighthood. But before I tell you how 500 knights shattered an army 60 times their size, you need to understand how this impossible moment began. Because the Battle of Montgisard was not just a battle. It was the moment when a dying boy stood between Jerusalem and destruction. If this story pulls you in the way it pulled me in when I first discovered it, subscribe to the channel. Because what you are about to hear is not the kind of history they teach in school. It is too unbelievable to be fiction, and too glorious to be forgotten. So, how did we get here? How did a Christian kingdom surrounded by the Muslim world survive for so long? To understand that, we must go back almost 80 years, back to the moment Europe woke from its sleep, and remembered that there were still things worth dying for. In 1096, Pope Urban II sent out a call that echoed from the Pyrenees to the Carpathians, a call to arms, a cry that set the soul of Europe on fire. Recover Jerusalem. Not for gold, not for land, not for some ordinary earthly prize, but for something deeper, something sacred. Thousands of knights sold everything they owned. They said goodbye to their families, knowing they would probably never return. Then they marched east. Many died on the road, many more died in battle. But in 1099, the impossible happened. Jerusalem fell into Christian hands, and from that victory, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was born. A Catholic stronghold in the middle of a hostile world, surrounded on every side by enemies who wanted it erased. For decades, it survived because those enemies were divided. Muslim caliphates and rulers fought one another almost as much as they fought the Crusaders. It was a delicate balance, fragile as glass. But in 1174, that balance shattered. That year, a man named Saladin became the ruler of Egypt and Syria. He was not an ordinary warlord. He was a military genius, a skilled diplomat, a charismatic leader, and he achieved what no one had managed for nearly a century. He united the Muslim world under one banner. His goal was clear as water in a desert oasis. Destroy the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Drive the Crusaders out of the Holy Land forever, and take Jerusalem back in the name of Islam. And at the exact moment when the most dangerous enemy in 100 years appeared on the horizon, fate played the cruelest card imaginable. The King of Jerusalem was only a teenager. Baldwin was barely 15 when he inherited the crown. But there was a problem that would have made almost any other man abandon the throne immediately. Baldwin had leprosy. And you need to understand what that meant in the 12th century. Leprosy was not just a disease, it was a sentence of fear, isolation, and slow disappearance. Lepers were pushed out of cities, forced to live apart from ordinary people, treated almost like the living dead. The disease attacked the body slowly. First, you lost feeling in your hands and feet. Then came the wounds. Then the deformity. Fingers wasted away. The face changed. The body became a prison that broke down piece by piece. And through all of it, the victim remained awake inside it, conscious, trapped. This was the king who had to face Saladin, a sick adolescent against the most formidable warrior of his age. The odds could not have been more unequal. Saladin knew it. The nobles of Jerusalem knew it. The entire region knew it. The kingdom of Jerusalem was doomed. It was only a matter of time. And in the summer of 1177, Saladin decided that time had come. He gathered the largest army he had ever commanded, 30,000 warriors, Mamluk cavalry, among the most disciplined horsemen in the Islamic world, Syrian archers capable of filling the sky with arrows, Egyptian infantry hardened by years of campaign. It was not just an army, it was a human tide, a moving storm of steel, dust, and certainty. Saladin's plan was brilliant because it was simple. While the main forces of Jerusalem were distracted in the north, he would invade from the south, he would take Gaza. Then he would march toward Ascalon, one of the most important ports in the kingdom. After that, with the coast secured, he would turn inland, and Jerusalem would fall. The kingdom would collapse like a house of cards. And at first, everything happened exactly as Saladin had planned. He crossed the border with little serious resistance. His scouts reported that the Christian army was scattered, disorganized, unable to respond in time. Gaza fell almost without a fight. Ascalon was placed under threat. Victory seemed so certain that Saladin allowed his soldiers to spread out and raid the nearby villages. His men scattered in search of plunder. Why not? There was no one left who could stop them. But someone was watching. Inside Ascalon, the young leper king received the news of Saladin's advance. His advisors begged him to wait. Wait for reinforcements. Stay behind the walls. Do not do anything reckless. After all, what could a sick king with barely 500 knights do against 30,000 warriors? Baldwin looked at them with eyes already beginning to fail from his illness. And then he said something they would never forget. If we wait, Jerusalem falls. If we hide, the kingdom dies. But if we attack now, while they believe they have already won, we can strike them where they least expect it. God does not ask us to win, He asks us to fight. Imagine what those knights must have felt in that moment. They knew it was madness. They knew the numbers were absurd. 60 enemies for every one of them. But then they looked at their king, a boy who should have been dying in a bed, sitting upright on a war horse despite the pain that every movement sent through his ruined body. And they understood something. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is riding toward death anyway, because some things matter more than survival. If this story is already gripping you, if you can feel even a fragment of what those knights felt 8 centuries ago, help this story reach more people. Like the video. Share it with someone who needs to remember that miracles are born when courage meets faith. At dawn on November 25, 1177, Baldwin rode out of Ascalon with his small army. 500 knights, Templars, Hospitallers, and the finest warriors the Crusader states could still gather, men who had sworn to defend the Holy Land until their final breath. But even they knew this was different. This was not just a battle. It was an act of faith wrapped in steel. They rode south, following the trail of destruction left by Saladin's army, burned villages, ruined fields, smoke fading into the hot desert air. With every mile, the reality of what they were about to attempt became clearer. They were not only outnumbered, they were completely alone. If they failed, there would be no rescue, no retreat, no second chance, only annihilation. But Baldwin did not hesitate, not once. Every jolt of the horse sent pain through his body. His bandaged hands could barely hold the reins. And still, he rode at the front. because that is what true kings do. They do not rule only from safe thrones. They rule from the front line, where blood is spilled and legends are born. Then his scouts returned with news that almost sounded too good to be true. Saladin's army was scattered, confident, careless, unprepared. They had camped near Montgisard, a small settlement between Ascalon and Jerusalem. They expected no serious resistance. Why would they? They had conquered everything in their path. The kingdom was on its knees. Baldwin gathered his commanders. Among them was Renaud of Châtillon, a veteran of countless wars, a man so fierce that his enemies spoke of him like a demon. There was also Odo of Saint-Amand, Grand Master of the Templars. His order had been created for exactly this kind of impossible hour. These men knew war. They knew the sound of steel, the smell of fear, the price of hesitation, but they had never faced odds like these. Baldwin explained the plan. It was not complex. It could not be. With so few men, subtlety was impossible. They would charge straight into the center of the enemy camp, straight toward Saladin's tent. One total cavalry charge. No reserves, no second wave. Everything or nothing. Victory or death. Odo of Saint-Amand looked at his king and asked the question every man was thinking. "My lord, what if we fail?" Baldwin smiled, a terrible smile on a face already marked by disease. "Then we die as Christian knights, and our souls go where no defeat can reach us." That afternoon, on November 25th, the shadows stretched across the hills of Montgisard. Saladin's army was resting, eating, celebrating, enjoying victories that were not yet fully secured. Their sentries were relaxed, their horses were not ready. Weapons lay stacked beside tents. To them, it looked like the perfect end to a perfect campaign. And then, they heard thunder. At first, it was only a distant sound, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. Then it grew louder, closer. The ground began to tremble. Horses stirred nervously. Soldiers stood and narrowed their eyes toward the western horizon, where the setting sun blinded them. And out of that sun, the knights appeared. 500 riders in wedge formation, their armor catching the last light of the day until they looked as if they were made of fire. The red crosses of the Templars burned against white mantles. The white crosses of the Hospitallers shone against black. And at the front of them all, mounted on a white horse, rode the Leper King. Baldwin IV wore a silver mask to hide the damage that illness had carved into his face. In his right hand, wrapped in blood-stained bandages, he held a sword he could barely feel. But it did not matter. He did not need to feel the steel. He only needed to raise it high and ride toward immortality. The charge began at a trot, then a canter, then a full gallop, a roaring avalanche of steel, hooves, and holy fury descending on Saladin's camp like judgment itself. Saladin's soldiers tried to form defensive lines. They tried to organize, but they were scattered, unready, completely surprised. The first men who met the charge were swept away like leaves in a storm. Knightly lances smashed through the confused ranks. War horses, trained for battle, struck and drove forward without stopping. Every knight became a moving fortress of iron. Arrows glanced from armor. Blades broke against shields. And still they came. Straight into the heart of the enemy camp. Straight toward the tent of Saladin. The Sultan could hardly believe what he was seeing. How was this possible? Where were his scouts? How had they failed to detect an entire army? Then he understood. It was not an army. It was a handful of desperate men. But they knew exactly where to strike. He ordered his personal guard to form around him. Thousands of his best warriors rushed to protect their leader. But the knights kept coming, breaking line after line, carving a path through chaos as if nothing in the world could stop them. Baldwin seemed to be everywhere. Despite his illness, despite the pain, despite a body that should have failed him long before that day, he fought like a man already beyond fear. His sword rose and fell. His knights fought with the fury of men who knew there was no retreat, no safety behind them, no mercy waiting ahead, only victory or a glorious death. Panic spread through Saladin's ranks faster than any blade. First, one unit fell back, then another, and suddenly the impossible was happening. The great army of Saladin, 30,000 strong, began to break beneath the charge of 500 knights led by a dying king. Saladin tried to stop the collapse. He shouted orders, he threatened, he pleaded, he tried to rally them, but fear is contagious. And once fear begins inside an army, it is almost impossible to contain. His soldiers fled in every direction. They abandoned weapons, armor, banners, treasure. All that mattered was escaping the Christian riders who seemed impossible to wound, impossible to slow, impossible to stop. And in the middle of that chaos, as night fell over Montgisard, Saladin made the hardest decision of his life. He fled. The great conqueror who had united the Muslim world, the man who had promised to destroy the kingdom of Jerusalem, fled the battlefield on a camel, guarded by only a small group of survivors. He left behind his army, his treasure, and his pride, because he understood one thing clearly: if he stayed, he would die, and a dead leader cannot return for revenge. At dawn, on November 26th, the battlefield of Montgisard revealed its impossible glory. An army of 30,000 had been defeated by 500. Saladin's force was shattered. Thousands lay dead. Thousands more had fled into the desert, where many would never return. The abandoned spoils were so vast that it would take weeks to count them. And in the middle of it all, covered in blood, dust, sweat, and pain, stood Baldwin, the leper king, the teenager who should have been dying in a bed, but instead had saved the kingdom of Jerusalem. The knights who survived that impossible charge knelt before him, not because they were ordered to, but because they understood what they had witnessed. They had seen a miracle. They had lost nearly a third of their men. Around 160 knights would never return home. But those dead had saved a kingdom. They had stopped Saladin cold. They had bought precious years for Christendom in the Holy Land. Baldwin rode back to Jerusalem through crowds that could hardly believe what had happened. People wept with joy. Church bells rang across the city. The miracle of Montgisard thundered through the Christian world. The leper king had become a legend. But if you think this story ends happily, you need to hear the whole truth. Because victory did not heal Baldwin, and it did not end Saladin's ambition. Subscribe now for more stories like this, because what happened after Montgisard proves something even more painful. Sometimes the man holding a kingdom together is the only thing keeping it from collapse. The years that followed were cruel to Baldwin. Leprosy does not forgive. It does not stop. It does not negotiate. Slowly and relentlessly, the disease continued to destroy his body. By the time he reached his 20s, he had lost the use of much of his hands. His vision worsened. Walking became almost impossible. At times, he had to be carried to the battlefield in a litter. His face was so damaged that he was said to hide it behind a silver mask. But he never stopped ruling, and he never stopped fighting. In 1179, only 2 years after Montgisard, Saladin attacked again. This time he was more careful, better prepared. Baldwin could no longer ride as he once had, so he was carried to the field. From there, he directed his army. His body was collapsing, but his mind remained sharp, and again, against the odds, he held Saladin back. In 1183, Saladin launched an even greater invasion. Baldwin gathered every force he could. He blocked access to water, harassed supply lines, used every strategy his brilliant mind could create. And once more, Saladin withdrew. 3 times. 3 times Baldwin IV stopped the greatest warrior of his age. A man who could barely see. A man who could barely move. A man whose body had become a map of suffering, but whose spirit burned brighter than any torch. In March of 1185, at only 24 years old, Baldwin IV finally surrendered to the disease. He died in Jerusalem, the city he had defended with every breath that remained in him. His broken body was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The kingdom he left behind survived without him for only 2 more years. Because Baldwin had not been just a king. He had been the pillar holding the entire kingdom upright. Without him, rivalries exploded. Bad decisions multiplied. And in 1187, only 2 years after his death, Saladin finally captured Jerusalem. Not because he had suddenly become a better general, but because the man who knew how to stop him was gone. The story of Baldwin IV is more than an unlikely military victory. It is proof of what the human spirit can do when it refuses to surrender. When every part of your body tells you to stop, when every voice tells you the odds are impossible, when the world tells you defeat is already decided, and still you say, no. He was only a sick teenager. He should have been a footnote in history. Instead, he became one of the most legendary kings Europe ever produced. He faced one of the greatest commanders of the medieval world, not once, but again and again, with a body that was falling apart. Remember that the next time you face something impossible. Remember the king who rode to battle when he should have been on his deathbed. Remember the 500 knights who charged into 30,000. Remember Montgisard, where courage and faith defeated logic and numbers. Because history is not written only by those with the best odds. It is written by those who refuse to accept defeat, no matter the price. Baldwin IV died young. His kingdom fell soon after. But his legend never died. Because on that November afternoon in 1177, on the dusty hills of Montgisard, a leper king and his knights taught the world that miracles are real, but only for those brave enough to ride toward them. If this story moved something inside you, write it in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that greatness does not come from the body, but from the spirit that refuses to bow. And never forget the words that defined Baldwin's life. God does not ask us to win. He asks us to fight. That is how a legend was born. That is how a hero died. And that is how 500 knights saved Jerusalem. This is the story that should never have been forgotten. The story of the leper king who refused to die before his work was done. The story of Montgisard, where courage shone brighter than the desert sun. Subscribe for more stories that will make you believe again in the greatness of the human spirit. Because history is full of forgotten Baldwins, and I will bring them back to life. Until the next battle, until the next legend.